Welcome everyone to the first of our 6 classes on the history of Judaism. We're going to do 3 in September and 3 in November. Thank you to Ellen for coming up with the idea. And so this will be a class in which we are set up for each hour will be a class unto itself. So you don't need to go from one to the next. You can simply come to one class and that will be fine. And what we're going to do first, of course, is biblical Judaism. So we're going to do 2 parts, 1 part on biblical Judaism, 2 parts on post-biblical Judaism in September. And then November, we're going to do American Judaism, Israeli Judaism, and Savannah Judaism. So the history of all of these areas. Welcome to everybody. Everybody's welcome to ask questions. We also have people watching, of course, online on YouTube and some people here. So we're going to get right to it. My name is Rabbi Haas again. Welcome to everybody joining us on Zoom or YouTube. We're going to go right to our sharing mode so that anybody here in person has this. And if anybody wants a copy of it, we can. It's basically a timeline and some maps, and we'll be using these throughout.
That's available by how?
Just give me a call. I can email you a PDF.
Okay.
It's also going to be something I'm showing on here, but anybody wants a PDF, just let me know. Okay, let me make sure. I'm stop sharing for the second, make sure I can let everybody else in who is coming in. All right, great. And we'll go back to now share mode. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about the biblical era in Judaism, the timeline of what goes on. Obviously, we can't be too thorough because we're talking thousands of years of history, but we can give everyone a general sense of how everything went about. And the more you want to look specifically at something, it's very simple. The more you can just simply go and look it up online. So obviously the very beginning of Judaism has to be the beginning of the world, although Judaism isn't started yet. So as you see on this calendar, I have, the civil year and the Jewish year. So, and some of them are, this is the exact counting using the Bible and the Torah to go backwards. So the first year of what we would call the Jewish year was about 3760 BCE. So we're talking 5,780 years ago. Exactly. And what we see here is, of course, the story begins with the creation of the world. We're not going to go into too much detail. God creates the world 6 days, rests on the 7th, and day 8 is day 1 for us. And we have, of course, the first human beings, Adam and Eve, who are not necessarily the only human beings around. Obviously, their son, Cain, finds a spouse. Their next son, Seth, finds a spouse. So we know they're the direct line to the Jewish world. Maybe the first human beings created according to the story, but then others are created elsewhere. Otherwise, there would just be Seth and nobody else. So Adam and Eve obviously are created. They leave the Garden of Eden. Cain and Abel, of course, have some issues. If you don't know the issues, Cain kills Abel. Cain walks the earth as a chastised person. And many people don't know that Seth is born. And Seth is the direct line to us. So when we look at Adam and Eve, we're not looking just at the birth of the world or the first human beings. We're looking at the direct line to the Jewish people. And that's why it's so essential. What's important also to remember about the creation of the world is that God created the world in an organized fashion. And most of the other creation myths that date earlier than ours, it is war and havoc, and that's how the world is created, where in this case we have day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7, showing some sort of science or organization to the world. Secondly, God looks at human beings almost as children. It says at the end of day 6, and this was very good. There's a relationship of love and caring expectation. However, in the other myths, that is not the case. And the other myths, the gods, multiple gods, use human beings as servants, slaves, playthings. They abuse them. They murder them. They will commit adultery with them against their own spouses. It is a very strange relationship. They also expect human beings to sacrifice to them. They also expect human beings to serve them. That is how they get their strength. Whereas this case, we have one God for everybody who loves everybody, has expectations for everybody. And that is a really impressive change in direction. It's so impressive that it's going to take a very long time for the world to come to this understanding. And when people read the Bible, it sounds very harsh because that's how they wrote it this time period, but it's also a do not do book. The Bible is a directional system for what not to do. And the better you are, the more important you are, the more mistakes you're going to make. And so, of course, Moses makes a lot of mistakes. Adam and Eve make mistakes. Noah makes mistakes. Abraham makes mistakes. Sarah makes mistakes. David, the greater you are, the more mistakes, because it's all about teaching us that everybody makes mistakes and we have to overcome them. So when we look at the line here, Cain has killed Abel. Cain is walking the earth. And we see Seth is born, and we have each generation labeled all the way from Adam and Eve to Abraham. So we have Adam and Eve, and then the 10th generation, of course, is Noah. Noah is still not the first, what we'd call Jew or Hebrew. Yes, Maury?
Quick question. I I know that there are various modern explanations for the impressive longevity without even having modern antibiotics. For instance, Adam living to age 930. I was just curious as to what the range of explanations, or if it's just shut up and accept it as is.
It is definitely not that. There's a lot of debate. Some say they had a different calendar. I think a lot of it has to do with Moses. That once we are given the commandments and we become Jewish, we have a limited timeline. So Moses lives 120. He is the oldest person from his time period on. So the previous generations, in many ways, are more myth. And it teaches a lot about how these beings are a little different. There's no expectations placed on them. There's no rules. They live their lives, not meaningless, but certainly in a different way. And once Moses is born, that is the limitation for what human beings can live. And to this day, there's only been one person who in recorded history who's lived past 120. It was a French woman who lived to 123 or 124, eating chocolate every day. That was her. So as I tell people, I'm basically immortal now, if that's the secret. So there are a lot of other thoughts to why they live longer. One would be the calendar again. Another is, again, because of the Moses factor. And also, I think it's a way to bring the creation of the world into the modern world that they're writing about. They want to create this connection. And if they have people living 50 years, the list is going to be very lengthy. And we also have to understand that it also gives connection to all the generations, because these generations you see, they all know each other. I mean, they're living hundreds of years, so they know each other. And it also shows that they, in some circles, there's a belief that they give advice to Abraham. That Abraham is hanging out with these ancestors because they live longer than his father. But by the 20th generation, and Abraham will live until his 180s, I believe, we see that it is basically the bloodline going from generation to generation, keeping this idea of a single God in some way, or perhaps just teaching us the bloodline of Abraham, who's going to be the first Jew, and showing that at times in his history, his family history, there were people who believed in one God, namely Noah, namely Adam and Eve and Seth. But not all the others we know as much about. Obviously, Methuselah lives the longest, but there's really no stories about any of them except for Noah and some minor little ones to some of the others. Enoch obviously is very famous because there's no death given to him, so some say he lives forever. But the important thing is to get to Abraham and to Sarah, and we meet him in his 75th year, which of course always asks the question, what was he doing beforehand? There's a lot of midrash, a lot of studies as to what did Abraham do to be chosen. And let's go down to some of our maps and show you, this is a map of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the center of the world when Abraham and Sarah are born and living. There's 3 nation-state areas. One is Egypt, one is Mesopotamia, and then a little bit later will be China. But what's important for us to know is that right here is where the world in many respects starts, on the Tigris and Euphrates. That's where you'll see which is where we see Abraham being born, right in the center of the world. The other, of course, will be on the other side on the Nile. And obviously, if you have water and you don't have to worry about it, and then you're going to be a little bit more stable. So this is where writing and the wheel and all these incredible things start. That's why they call these the center of the world. So, and we're going to learn later that whoever controls Mesopotamia and whoever controls Egypt don't usually get along. They're usually fighting with each other, which is a real problem. We'll talk about that later. So we get to Abraham, and Abraham is what we would call the first monotheist. Maybe not the first Jew. He's certainly not referred to that. We're not referred to Jews till really much later, almost post-biblical, depending, because of the name Judah. He does not create the religion, because in order to have a religion, you need to have people. And he doesn't have people. He has his family and the servants and the people in his small community. So he does believe in God, as does his wife, and they will pass down these ideas through the ages. So Abraham will be born in Ur. He'll move to what is today Turkey with his family, the Turkey area, and live in Haran. And that is where he gets the call with him and Sarah, go to this area over here called Canaan. What is Canaan? Canaan in the ancient world is the middle of absolutely nowhere. It is going from New York City to Chicago to the middle of nowhere, Texas. There are some wonderful things about the area, but for the most part, you're nowhere. The only thing you have access to is you do have access to the Mediterranean, but of course he's living in the desert, and there are trade routes going from Mesopotamia to Egypt, and we'll look at those in a little bit, but it's in the middle. So basically, this is one of the remarkable things. God says, Abraham, I want you to go in the middle of nowhere with your family, and you won't know anybody, and there'll be nothing there. And that's where you're going to start this people, which is interesting because in many religions, Israel's holy. Islam, it's holy. Why? Because Muhammad was there. Christianity, it's holy because Jesus was born there and was resurrected there. In Judaism, it's holy because it is holy, because it's holy before we get there. So it's not because Abraham did anything there. Moses didn't even make it into it. It's because it's holy, the land. So God makes the covenant with Abraham and Sarah, and they have children. We know the story of Isaac and Jacob, the boys who are exact opposites. The line will go through Isaac and then to Jacob, and each will marry spouses that will be very influential and important. Isaac will marry, of course, Rebecca, and Jacob will marry Leah and Rachel. And they have other wives as well, as was often the case to help increase the population. But they keep it within their family. So it's not a religion yet. So when we read the book of Genesis, we have to understand this is a precursor. This is the prequel. This is the beginning. For those of you who are science fiction fans, this is The Hobbit before The Lord of the Rings. For those of you who are not science fiction fans, you really need to read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. They're awesome. So this is the prequel that will get us to the book of Exodus, which is really the bread and butter. The great stories are important because they teach us about ourselves, the mistakes that Abraham, Sarah, Rachel, Rebecca, Leah, Jacob, and Isaac make throughout their lives. We can study more about the specifics later, but we got thousands of years to go in just 40 minutes. So Moses is the moment when the religion begins. So Joseph ends up the great-grandson of Abraham, and Sarah ends up going into Egypt. He's sold as a slave by his brothers, lovely brothers. He ends up becoming a big macher, fights his family to come into Egypt, and then years after he dies, not very long afterwards, they're enslaved. And so, as we know, you would think that people in enslavement would not procreate so quickly. However, in our world today, who or what areas have the highest birth rates? Which areas? The places that are first world, America, Europe, Japan, or the places that are second world, Russia, or the places that are third world, Africa, the Middle East? Which places tend to have more kids? The answer is it's the third world. It's generally the areas that aren't as economically solvent. And that's just the way the world works. And this is what happens. These slaves end up having lots of kids. And they are slaves. Moses, of course, is born as an Israelite. You can call it Israelite and Hebrew are interchangeable, even though there's a theory that there were two different people, which is very possible, but we'll use them interchangeably. Moses is born, second chapter of Exodus, and then 80 years later, after being raised in the household of Pharaoh, he comes back after finding a wife and living for many years in Midian, seeing the burning bush. He will come back and he will lead the people out of Egypt. Now you can see the dates here. The BCE dates are guesstimates. We don't know for sure when all of these happens. The Jewish year is exactly what it is. So the Jewish word's exact. That's because they go back. But to relate it exactly to the Gregorian calendar is really difficult. So when did the Exodus happen? Some say 1300, some say 1250, some say much earlier. Was Abraham really born? What do they say here in 1813? That's one of the main guesses. But again, it's guesswork, a lot of it. We have no proof of Abraham, Isaac. There's no proof of anybody in Genesis. There's no proof of Moses even existing. The farther back you go, the less evidence you have. Glenn, did you have a question? And you were on mute.
But you also got to remember what was what was going on in the rest of the world and around 1300, 1200 before the Common Era, you had a total collapse of the Bronze Age empires.
Yeah, and what we're going to see, and that's an excellent point, and that goes directly to what's going to happen with the Israelites. And these are one of the things I'm actually going to do an Ollie course on it next month. That's in Bluffton, that discusses the Exodus from Egypt. How were these Israelites able to leave a powerful country like Egypt? Well, they were on a very big downturn. It was a low point in their history for a variety of reasons. And one of them obviously was the Bronze Age mixing with the Iron Age. It had to do with floods. It had to do with the economy. There are a lot of things going wrong at the same time. And so after Moses leads the people into the desert, this is where we find the religion, because whatever they did in that desert, that's where we got the religion. They go to the mountain, get the 10 commandments, get all the commandments, but they're spending 40 years in the desert, really about 38 years-ish in one city in the desert, Kadesh Barnea, but they're in this area for about 40 years, and that's what they do. They develop this religion. And what we see here is the course they take. As you can see, when they leave Egypt, they go into, and it's the page, the route of Exodus, into the Sinai. You see how I'm following it? And then you can also realize that this is all guesswork. We have no idea exactly which they went. We know they got to Kadesh Barnea. We know they got there, so they end up here. We just don't know how they get there because we don't know the names of all these places. If you go to the Sinai, there is a place that they call Mount Sinai. It is the place everybody walks up. Why is that the place? Because like 150 years ago, monks set up a church there and said, this has got to be Mount Sinai. So everybody climbs that mountain, but there's a lot of mountains in the Sinai, and Mount Sinai is not supposed to have been a big mountain anyway. So we don't even know where Mount Sinai is. We know they go through the desert some way, either this way or this way or this way, and then they end up in Kadesh Barnea, where they spend 38 plus years. And then they leave, and then we know they go in this way coming into Jericho. That we do know. So that part we know right here because some of those are still around, but we don't know the rest. So we do know that when they go in to the land, that they go in not as one group of people, but as multiple groups of tribes. So they're one group. Moses is the political leader. Aaron is the religious leader. They go in, though, with the tribes still organized as tribes. We don't know exactly what was going on while they were slaves, but it's pretty obvious that the tribes stayed tribes, or they did it right afterwards, but that would have taken a lot of effort. So because we see the tribal names so quickly after they leave, we assume that they were living in tribal systems. Now, when they go to Israel, or Canaan as it was called back then, they do not live together. They live in groups within their own tribe. Now I'm realizing this picture is a little big for here, but let's see if I can make it smaller. The answer is I probably can, but it'll take a long time to figure it out. So as you can see, they live in tribes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there's 12 tribes. Are there really 12 tribes? The answer is no. There's sort of 12 tribes, but there's really 13. As you can see, Manasseh and Ephraim are the sons of Joseph. Joseph gets 2 tribes. So there's actually 13 tribes. However, only 12 tribes get land because the tribe of Levi becomes the tribe of priests. So they live all over the place. So You will see the tribes, how they are assigned, and it's going to be very important because Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, especially who live on the other side of the Jordan, will be some of the first tribes to disappear. You can relate the actual people in Genesis to their tribes. In other words, who is the most important person in the book of Genesis? Who is a son of Jacob? It is probably Judah. Judah becomes the leader of the family. Joseph becomes the most important person because he, of course, is the grand vizier of Egypt, but Judah is the head of the family. What tribe is going to become the most powerful tribe? Judah. The second most powerful tribe is going to be Ephraim, and this is Joseph's son. He is the youngest son, and if you want to be something in the Bible, it's a good idea not to be the eldest son, because the Bible teaches us time and again the eldest son should not automatically get the best stuff. Moses is not the eldest son, probably. David's not the eldest son. Judah's not the eldest son. Ephraim's not the eldest son. Isaac's not the eldest son. Jacob's not the eldest son. And so Ephraim is the second son of Joseph. And when Joseph takes Manasseh and Ephraim to be blessed by his father Joseph, Joseph's supposed to put his right hand on Manasseh and his left hand on Ephraim, because the right hand's weaker. And what does Jacob do when he's blessing his grandchildren? He goes like this, and he puts the main blessing on the younger child. Ephraim will be the second most important tribe. Now they're living in Israel, and they're doing fairly well as tribes. They're fighting the local Canaanites, but a problem arises, and that is somebody moves to town who is a lot stronger than these little tribes, and they're called the Philistines. So the Philistines move into town, and we're talking 12th century, 11th century BCE, and they're a lot stronger. First of all, they have iron. Second of all, they've seafaring people, so they're expert and they're very organized, and they are able to knock off one tribe at a time. And so in the book of Judges, we see these individual tribal leaders who become warriors to protect the tribes. And here they are: Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, and for the most part, they fail. Certain ones are very successful, like Deborah, probably the most successful, or Deborah. Some are total failures, like Samson. Samson's supposed to defeat the Philistines, and he ends up going blind. He does kill some when he dies. So what the people ask Samuel, who is now the leader of the Jewish world, how do you know Samuel's important? If you have 2 books in the Bible named after you, you're probably pretty important. And so they ask him to choose a king. And he doesn't want a king. He thinks God is the king. So he chooses this guy. His name is, anybody know the first king? It's not David. It is Saul. Good job. Saul is the first king. And he is a failure. He looks like he's going to be a success. Samuel, one of the greatest sages in our history, knows what he's doing. He picks a really good-looking guy who's tall and really handsome and who's a good warrior. And he says, this is going to be our guy. And everybody's like, yeah, he's going to be great. The problem is he comes from the tribe of Benjamin, which is one of the weakest tribes. It is akin to becoming the president of the United States as a libertarian. Nobody in Congress is going to support you. And that's what happened. He's from a small tribe. He fails. The fact that he goes crazy doesn't help. And he is supplanted by David. And David will become, of course, the second king and the greatest king. And again, Which year does he live? These years are very different than what most people. This is a guesstimate. Most will say he actually lives a century earlier than this, that it's around the year 1000. But I took this one to show the difference. I've been using one where he becomes king around the year 1000. This one has him in 877. We don't know when he was king. We can prove there was a King David because we found ancient artifacts from the 9th century that say House of David. But his son, for instance, Solomon, there's nothing that proves Solomon existed beyond the Bible. So we don't know the ages. We just know David is a king. He is the best of the best. He's like Glenn. He's smart, good looking. He's athletic. He's a warrior. He's a poet. He's a singer. Everybody loves him. He becomes this great king. He unites everybody. He wins everything. And then, of course, everything falls apart because the better you are, the Bible teaches us, the harder you're going to fall, or the bigger the mistakes. And his big mistake, of course, is falling in love with a married woman. He ends up doing the deed with her. She gets pregnant. He calls her husband's unit back from the front just so her husband can go and be with his wife, and he'll think it's his son. But Uriah is a good person. He comes back from the front. He says, I'm not going to go see my wife. I'm going to stay with my men. They can't go see their wives because they don't all live in Jerusalem. And so what happens is David sends his unit on a suicide mission. With Uriah out of the way, he can then marry, of course, Bathsheba. Of course, that son is going to die. And for the next 20 years, he is going to be inflicted with one tragedy after another. His son's going to die. His son's going to abuse his sisters. One son is going to take the kingdom and he's going to have to flee. There's going to be infighting. But his next leader will be, of course, Solomon, who's the next son of Bathsheba. And what we see here that David did, which was so brilliant, is he sees all the different tribes and he puts the capital right in the middle of the country, right here. So that everybody is equal distance to it. And that Ephraim and Judah, the two main tribes, are very close to the center. And that center he's going to call Jerusalem. Later, Solomon's going to put the temple in Jerusalem, and that'll be the center. And Solomon does a very good job as being a king, but he also has some issues. He does not go to war as much as his father, but he rules more by creating alliances. But you've probably read he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, or was it vice versa? So he's 1,000 wives. Well, the problem is that he doesn't marry them because of his libido. He marries them to make treaties with everybody. But the problem is all these women are now in Jerusalem and they are not monotheists. They're not Jewish and they're creating havoc everywhere. And that becomes a real problem. So after he dies, we have an issue. The north, if you see this, Jerusalem is right around here. The northern tribes, which is about 10 tribes, depending how you count it, send an emissary to Judah, to his son Rehoboam, and say, listen, your father taxed us a lot, especially the northern part, to build his palace, to build his roads, to build his temple. We want you to ask to lower the taxes. And they're not screaming and yelling. They're bringing this, this proposition to the new king. And Rehoboam has two sets of advisors. His father's advisors who say, yeah, we taxed him too much. Better give him a break. And his own young Turk advisors who say, how dare these people talk to you? You're the king. You got to show them what it is. Show them the whip. And so Rehoboam basically says, you think my dad taxed you? I'm going to tax you even worse. and there is a civil war. And what ends up happening is the Jewish country is divided into two. And we end up with two Jewish countries. Israel in the north, with Ephraim as the main tribe, and Judah in the south, with mostly Judah. There's a little bit of maybe Benjamin, maybe a little Simeon in there as well. And we have two countries. The north is going to be the more powerful country in terms of armaments and what they have at their disposal, because Judah is a lot of desert. This middle part is hill country. It's nice, but the northern part is all hill country and beautiful, and they have a port. But Judah is going to have the same family as their king for hundreds of years. It's always going to be the line of David. It's a direct line. David, Solomon, Rehoboam, it just goes down, down, down. Always going to be the line of David. Israel is going to have a series of kings. Usually a king will have his son, and then his son will be killed off, and then you'll have another one. And then his son and grandson, his grandson. So they have a series of kings, and none of them are considered great because they may not have been as dedicated to God as they should have. Secondly, the Torah and the Bible is probably written by people, edited by people from the South, so they're very South-centric. And so they live together as two countries. Sometimes they fight with each other, they're like brothers. They sometimes fight with each other, and sometimes they get along. Sometimes one is subservient to the other. But what happens is tragic, because remember we talked about Mesopotamia and Egypt. The only reason David had a powerful country, and I forgot to put the list, David really enlarges the country. It goes all the way, I didn't put that one in here, sorry. It goes all the way to, David's country goes all the way from Israel to Iraq. So it's pretty large. But the only reason David can have a powerful country is Mesopotamia and Egypt have to be downtrodden. If you're in between the two biggest bullies, and both bullies are in the hospital, you can be the top guy. But if those bullies start getting stronger again and getting out of the hospital, and they like to fight each other, you're having a problem, because Israel's the worst place to have a kingdom. What you see here is this whole area is the trade, right in the middle of the trade route between Mesopotamia and Egypt. You can only go two ways from Egypt to Mesopotamia. You can go by sea, which is treacherous, or you can go by land right through this area. Because if you go a little bit farther out here, what is the problem? Out here in this whole area, this is the Arabian desert, and it's really big, and nobody goes through there. So the only way for these two big bullies to fight each other is go smack through here. There's a couple of trade routes. That's the only way. It's a terrible place to have a kingdom.
The DMZ zone.
Exactly. And so what we'll see here is the trade routes. The trade routes go right through this area. There's several of them. Some are on the other side of the Jordan, and some. So the only reason this area is of any importance is because people like to fight each other and go that way to fight each other. And both those areas have water, and they are much more advanced. And so what eventually happens is these great, powerful city, nation states start to evolve again in Mesopotamia. There had been a long time before major powers, but the Assyrians, who are from this area, take over a good portion. I don't have their kingdom, but I can show you another example of a kingdom, Persia. Persia takes over a huge area. The Assyrians will too. And they come in and they destroy Israel. And they take the 10 tribes there, and we don't know what happens to them, and they become the 10 lost tribes. Probably a lot of them came south into Judah and mixed with Judah, and many of them ended up being transported and disappeared and became part of the Assyrian Empire. This is the end of tribal Judaism, because Jews had still been tribal, but once the north is destroyed and everybody moves to the south, there's only really two tribes left over a few generations, and the Judah and the Levites, Judah and Levi, and and they both intermingle so much that tribal Judaism. So if somebody says, I'm from the tribe of Reuben, they have some documents that nobody else in history has, because we don't have any documents about what happens to these groups of people unless it's by word of mouth. The only people who can say they're from a tribe is if you are from the tribe of Levi, because you were priests. I am from the tribe of Levi. There's two groups. There's the lower priest, which is anybody from the tribe of Levi, or the high priest, which is anybody from the family of Aaron, so I'm a Levite. How do I know? I'm sorry.
Can I
Sure.
just ask a question?
Sure.
All these tribes, they were all family based?
Yep.
So they were all, the tribe of Levi as a family? And
Yes,
okay.
exactly. They descended from the individuals in theory.
Okay.
But again, the 10 tribes disappear. One or two had already disappeared as well. And once they all moved together, the tribal Judaism ends. We don't know if it probably kept around for a while. I mean, it's probably a real ruckus. Now, how did Judah survive? That's the question, because Israel was actually a lot stronger militarily than Judah, and they got wiped really quickly. The answer is there was a king named Hezekiah who had a brilliant idea. Hezekiah, and this is the 8th century, circa 720s. And and I don't know why I didn't put it on there. Anyway, he knew that they could not stand against the Assyrians. But Jerusalem is on a mountain, and it's a walled city. And he knew that the Assyrians were going to siege his city of Jerusalem, but what's the best way to siege a walled city so you don't lose anybody? It's really easy. You just surround the city and wait for them to starve. Nobody dies. None of your soldiers die. It takes not very long, because you need water. It should only take a couple of weeks. And then by the time you attack, everybody's almost dead. It's really easy. And he knew this. So he dug an underground cistern to a water source he knew was underground, so that they had unlimited water. He brought all the people from the countryside, said, come up here. The Assyrians didn't know they had water. If you have water, you can plant, you can give water to your cows and chickens, and you can survive for a long period of time. So after a couple of months, the troops are just getting really restless. Why are we sitting here so long? And they give up. They say, listen, pay us off and we're going to leave. Hezekiah paid them off and they left, and Judah's still here. And that's how Judaism survived. So Hezekiah saves Judaism, and we will continue to be living in this country as an independent country until 586, 587. Now, what happens at 586, 587? That is the destruction of the temple. So you can see it right here. I don't know why I did not have it on this one. I'll redo this one later. I took this down. I must have noticed that.
Not in my timeline.
It's not in the timeline. It should be.
Shame on you.
Yes, I will fix it for later. These, by the way, this timeline is not necessarily accurate, because except for, so here it says 492, the first temple is destroyed. It's probably more like 586. But here, I'll fix this later. This is one of the ones I used to show there's a lot of difference. So the temple is destroyed. And this should be the end of Judaism. Why should it be the end of Judaism? Because the Babylonians, who had conquered the Assyrians, takes most of the leadership, or all the leadership of the Jewish world, into Babylon. And that should be the end, because whenever you take over somebody in the ancient world, they take your gods, because your God was stronger, was weaker. Their God kills your God or defeats your God. You just take their God. It's a really easy, interchangeable way of living. So we don't know what happens to these Israelites when they enter Babylon in the exile. But what we do know is they stay Jewish. We have very little evidence of what they did in Babylon. We have the story, for instance, of, although it's not Babylon, of Esther and Mordecai. But they really don't know what happens in this period. But we know they stay Jewish. Because 50 years later, the king of Persia, who's defeated the Babylonians, is going to let the Jews go back to Israel. He says, go back there. I'm going to pay for you to build your temple. I want to repopulate this, because he had a different view. Cyrus felt like, I want people in their native lands, and I'm going to tax them. I'm going to let them have basically carte blanche to live their lives. Just pay your taxes and don't rebel. That's all basically what he wanted. So he has a very different empire than the Babylonians, who didn't look at the world this way. So he's like, go back, build your temple, and be good citizens. Now, we don't have evidence of him actually saying this to the Jews, but we have evidence of him saying this to a lot of other groups. And since really the Jews at the time were a minor group, it's not unheard of that they didn't mention them. So a small group goes back and they build kind of a smaller temple. But why did most of them probably stayed in Babylon? It's because the people living in Babylon who were Jewish were not the ones who lived in Israel. It's the next generation, or 2 generations later. And they're home. They're living in New York City. And now the king of Persia says, oh, you can go back to West Texas and build a temple. I'm giving you this gift. And most of them said, I'm going to pass. I'm going to take a pass on this. I'm going to stay here in this metropolitan country that has everything I want and is treating me probably pretty well. But in the 5th century, when these Ezra and Nehemiah, a governor who's sent by the leader of Persia, and a scribe, go back and kind of reorient Israel to being stronger Jewishly. And so the Persians are going to be in control of the Holy Land all the way till the time of a guy named Alexander. So the second temple is built circa 516. I think I just put some of these dates can go either way. And we're living large in Persia. We have the story of Esther and how things are going great for the Jews in Persia till this evil man Haman comes along. It's a farce. So we live in Persian Israel and have really what we believe to be our own governing ability. Again, we're still subservient to Persia, but we have our own way of governing, and they give a hands off in many ways as long as we're doing what we're supposed to do. But in 332, that is going to change, because in 332, which is also not here, and I need to put it on here. Somehow some of this stuff is missing. I'll send another one out for next time. And I'll show you a different one. 332, a guy named Alexander takes over the world. He's 30, I think by 32, he controls the world. And makes us feel a little underwhelming about ourselves. I didn't conquer the world by 32. I tried, failed. So he conquers the world. He goes into Israel, and as with everywhere else, he says, listen, if you throw down your arms, I'm not going to kill anybody. Just throw down your arms and become part of my world. And that's what they did. They threw down their arms and said, welcome, Alexander. Happy to have you here. Gave him a big hug. Nobody was killed. And all of a sudden, we're part of the Greek world. Now you might ask, why would we give up our allegiance to Persia? Well, first of all, we're not going to beat the Greeks. They had a really powerful army. Secondly, everybody wanted to be Greek. Why do you want to be Greek? Because Greek had the best stuff. The Greeks had everything. They've got clothing. They've got a philosophy, math, science, literature, roads, spices, trade routes, the games, everything that we have today just about is based upon these Greeks. Brilliant beyond anything the world has ever seen. And we like being part of the world because when you're part of the Greek world, you get better stuff. And guess what? People like stuff. I like my stuff. I have lots of stuff. We all have stuff and we like it. And the Greeks so we loved being part of the Greeks. And it was a really good period. But of course, he dies very quickly. He dies only a few years after he takes Israel. And after he dies, this is a map again of the Persian Empire. You can see that they controlled all of Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey, parts of Turkey, parts of Jordan, Israel, parts of the all the way to India. So they had into Russia. Yeah. So they owned a big chunk of the world. The Greeks, of course, took over more. So what we see here is after he dies, after Alexander dies, his empire is divided among his generals. The ones that are most important to us are Ptolemy, who is going to be the ruler of what is Egypt. You can see he will control Israel, going all the way up into Lebanon, all the way to Syria, and Seleucid, who's going to control what is today Iraq, Iran, all the way to Turkey. So those two are most important. So they're divided. We live in the Greek world doing very well, having a good time. People love being Greek.
It does look fun.
Yes, it was fun probably. Because at this time, this period of the Greeks is before they get ethics. I mean, this is the period where they're doing crazy, they're crazy intellectual and crazy fun. But eventually, the Seleucid Greeks take over Israel. This green area take over Israel. And a king is going to come into power. His name is Antiochus. And he is going to say, no more being Jewish, no more praying to your God. He goes in the temple, sacrifices pigs to Zeus. Jews are forbidden to engage in any Jewish religious enterprise. And this will be, of course, the holiday of Hanukkah, which is not in the Bible, but is still considered part of the biblical era. These Jews, led by the Maccabees, fight back. They kick the Seleucid Greeks out of the country, which is a major upset. We're talking the 69 Mets. I mean, it's big. One of the reasons is because the Seleucid Greeks are dealing with this minor intrusive fellow, calls himself the Roman Empire. I mean, so little things like that did take his mind off this little nothing country. but they kicked it out, and we would have our own country again for about 100 years. And the Maccabees' children turn out to become who their parents fought, because the Maccabees' children take names like Alexander. They take names like Hercules. If they take Greek names, it tells you what type of people. They became kind of corrupt. And eventually the Romans come in, they're asked to arbitrate between two brothers, who's going to be the new king, and they choose the weaker brother, and 100 years later, they basically take control. So in the mid first century, think of the time of Julius Caesar, Pompey, later Augustus. The Romans will be in charge of this area, and they will take charge. And at first it's not so bad, but it gets harsher and harsher as time goes on. And eventually there comes to be division within the Jewish ranks. There are those Jews who support the Romans. There are those Jews who want to rebel, the Zealots. There are those Jews who go off in the desert and just want to live out their lives and die in the desert. We only know about them. They're like flower children from the 60s who just want to go, and the men who just want to go in the desert and die off. The only reason we know anything about the Essenes, or the only reason they're not a footnote in history, is because the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had the library of Dead Sea Scrolls. They disappear. We find the scrolls. We know who they are. So you have the group that supports the Romans, the rebels, these who want to go out in the middle of nowhere, and then you have the proto-rabbis, the people who want to stop praying, stop sacrificing, who want to do prayer and want to do study. And these groups are at odds with each other, even as the Romans are imposing their will. We didn't even get a chance to talk about Herod, who was a vicious king, who was a Jew. He was Idumean. His family had been forcibly converted by the Maccabees families, and he ended up being basically persecuted his life because he was part of a forced conversion group. He ends up being king by making friends with Augustus, and then, of course, takes total control on behalf of Rome and kills lots of Jews. He's the one who enlarges the temple, though. And as time comes, these groups of Jews have difficulty working with each other, even as the Romans are being more and more abrasive. We will go into 3 wars against the Romans. 3 wars. We did great in all 3 wars. And that is bad. If you're going to go to war with the Romans, lose quickly, because they do not like wasting resources on these nothing little areas in the middle of nowhere. And we were in the middle of nowhere. So we rebel in 66. We actually do pretty well for a while. They have to bring in some legions led by Titus and his father. I just forgot his name. Please help me. Vespasian. And Vespasian and Titus will take control. Vespasian goes back to Rome. He ends up becoming emperor, and Titus will destroy the temple in the year 70.
That's why I've been circling Titus.
And that will be the end of the temple era. If you go to Rome, you will see the Arch of the Titus, which shows a picture of the Romans taking the menorah from the temple. That's how we know the menorah was still there. Possibly also taking an Ark of the Covenant, but not the original, a later one. Now, during this period, again, we have to understand this could have been the end of Judaism, because we had spent countless generations focusing on the temple. That is where we pray, that's where we sacrifice, that's the center. Now with the temple gone and Jews forbidden to go in Jerusalem, it could be a real problem. However, this is where the scholars, the proto-rabbis, come into play. And one man named Yochanan ben Zakkai asked permission to start a seminary, and that is where Rabbinic Judaism really starts to take control. The priests lose total control because their control is based upon the temple. With no temple, there are still people who believe they are related or descended from the priests. I'm one of them. The Cohen are the high priests, the Levites are the lower priests, but they don't really have any role in Judaism. They can say a few prayers here and there. But if you say I'm a Cohen, it's not a big deal. I mean, you can say a few prayers, but you're not in charge of anything. What happened was we started to study and to really stress that. But then we went on another revolt, and the 117, 111, 112, went to 117. Then we go on a major revolt again in the 130s, 120s, and that is called the Bar Kokhba Revolution, where the great Rabbi Akiva believes Bar Kokhba is the Messiah. And this rebellion lasts many years. It is a guerrilla rebellion, and it frustrates the Romans over and over again. They have to take legions from their war with the Parthians to come in, and they are not happy. And they lose a lot of men from this guerrilla warfare. And so when they finally defeat Bar Kokhba and his mighty men, they burn the country to the ground. And they kill everybody they can find. Scholars, women, children. The country will not recover until the 20th century. Remember all those trees we sent to Israel? Remember in the 19th century, there are no trees in Israel. It's all desert and swamp. And that begins with this burning in the year in the 130s by the Romans. I mean, other things happen in the next millennia, but this is where it begins. Eventually, and we'll talk later, the leadership of the Jewish world will leave. So Maury, did you have a question? So basically, the biblical era ends either in the year 70 or in the 130s. Year 70 with the destruction of the temple, the 130s with the Bar Kokhba revolution. When Yochanan ben Zakkai set up that place in Yavna as study, that's where many believe the Bible was canonized. So we know probably all the biblical, but we know for sure all the biblical books were written before the year 90 CE, and the Dead Sea Scrolls prove that. So the last books to make it into the Bible were probably written in the 3rd century BCE, like in the 200s before the Maccabees. But the final books in the order with the chosen language are probably cemented in stone around the year 90. That's a guesstimate. So the Bible we have today is based upon the choice they made in the year 90-ish. And other interesting things, and we'll stop in a minute. Any other questions? Remember Hezekiah, the guy who built the underground cistern that saved Judaism? That's a myth. You know, it's a myth about how this great king did something miraculous and God helped him to save the people. It is a myth. At least it was until they found it. So in the 19th century, a British archaeologist named Benjamin Warren finds a shaft that goes into it. They find writing from the time of Hezekiah that proves that was actually true. So you can go into Hezekiah's tunnel in Israel only in the summer. Why can you not go in it during the winter or in other times? Because it's filled with water. So even in the summer, the water's sometimes up to the knees. So there's water there all year round. So it really helps to prove that Hezekiah did come up with that. One of the other interesting things is there was the centerpiece for the Jewish Museum in Jerusalem, which has a lot of good stuff, even when little kids knock over vases. That's a joke because that just happened like a week ago, a little kid knocked. There was a little signet from the high priest seal. So the high priest seal from the time of Solomon. It's the only thing they have from the time of Solomon, except for theoretically the bottom bricks at the wall. It is the piece was beyond compare. It was irreplaceable. And then 20 years ago, they found out it was a fake. So there was an archaeologist who did that little thing where you find things and date them earlier to make yourself more important. Well, he had done this. So although it was old, it was from like the 6th century. It was not from the 10th century, and that makes a huge difference. So there's no proof of Solomon. The farther back you go, there's less proof. There is proof David existed. There's proof of the temples. We see it. So a lot of it has to do with faith, but this is the biblical era. So that's the biblical area in just over an hour. I got a question over here.
Why do we know that Solomon's David's son?
Good question. She wants to know, why do we know Solomon's David's son? In the Bible, it says Solomon is David's son, and he certainly could have been. We have no extra biblical evidence of him. So there's a lot of people we don't have extra biblical evidence, but we do have it of David. We just don't have it of Solomon. We do have it, I believe, of Rehoboam. So we don't have it of Saul. So unless we find some of these things, could they be true? Absolutely. I mean, there certainly could be true, since we know there's a King David. As we get farther back, some things are probably myth. We'll never be able to prove Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah. They weren't literate. They lived in the middle of the desert. It really is impossible. Moses, unlikely, because they were probably not as literate, and they were slaves, and nobody writes about slaves winning. So the Egyptians, who were notoriously centered on winning, did not write epitaphs at the Temple of Karnak to great Egyptian leaders like Pharaoh, who lose all of their slaves. They're just not going to do that. So there's very little, it's not likely we're going to find evidence of Moses either. But again, it's all about faith, and it's about the meaning. It's not just about, so we'll finish here. Any other questions? And then next week, what we're going to do is we're going to do post-biblical Judaism for 2 weeks. So next week, we're going to talk about the center of the Jewish world. The center of the Jewish world has always been Israel, except for a short time in Babylon. But we're going to talk about, where does the center of the Jewish world go after this happens, after the end of the biblical era? It's in Israel, a little bit in Babylon. These are the two biggest Jewish communities. But what happens after the destruction of the temple? Where is Judaism going to be based? We'll look at things like Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazic Jews. And let me give you a hint. There were no Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews during the time of Moses. That does not go back that far. So we'll see you next week. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to people who came in person. Thank you to people who are on Zoom. And thank you to people who are joining us on YouTube. This will stay on YouTube. And again, next week, same time, same bad channel, we'll talk about post-biblical Judaism. Thanks, guys, for joining us.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Have a good one, everybody.
Yeah.